Let's wrap up, how does food become energy for my body? Let's take all the pieces of the unit and put it together to answer this main question of the unit. First off, we learned about various parts of the respiratory system. These were written down in your word wall. Trachea, or windpipe, is where any air that you breathe in first enters your respiratory system. From there, it branches through your bronchial tubes. And from your bronchial tubes, it's going to move into the small passages of your lungs. And the smallest part is called the alveoli, which are these small air sacs where you can concentrate a lot of oxygen to end up diffusing into capillaries that are wrapped around the lungs. So if you could pause the video and write down this principle, when we breathe in air, alveoli in the lungs absorb oxygen and pass it to the red blood cells. So next is the role of the circulatory system. The circulatory system kind of rotates in a figure eight, with arteries pumping blood away from your heart, and then veins pumping blood towards your heart. The alveoli in your lungs exchanges oxygen and moves from the capillaries into your circulatory system. From there, it gets carried to smaller and smaller passages throughout your body until it goes through the smallest passage of all, which is the capillaries. And then it can diffuse into your cells. So write down our next principle, that the heart pumps the blood, circulating it around the body, which delivers oxygen and glucose to the cells. Now you already have a principle that explains how these things get into the cells, because we know that cell membranes are semi-permeable and allow glucose and oxygen to pass from the blood into them. In activity 5.3, just to review, we learned that starches are composed of glucose. And when we made a bag of dialysis tubing filled with glucose and starch, after 24 hours, glucose diffused into the water, but starch remained in the bag. And this has to do with the fact that the dialysis tubing is like a cell that is semi-permeable. The starch was too large a molecule to pass through the openings in the dialysis tubing, while the glucose was much smaller and able to pass through. So this brings us to the idea of scientific principle number 10. We know that sugar and oxygen arrive in the cell, and then there's some type of a chemical reaction. Here are the chemical formulas for sugar, or glucose, and oxygen. And this is a molecular model. So you have to remember what our product has to be made of is either made out of carbon, hydrogen, or oxygen, because those are the types of particles that we start with. One of the products of this chemical reaction is what you breathe out. So the product of this chemical reaction that we discussed earlier this week is carbon dioxide. This is what you exhale as the air goes the reverse path that it came into your system. So it goes from your alveoli into your bronchial tubes, out your trachea, and your nasal passages again. However, there is one more product that we can't quite figure out. So just take a look at what we have to work with. Right? We use a lot of carbon and oxygen molecules to make carbon dioxide. But obviously, look at those white molecules. We have a lot of hydrogen that we have not used at all. There is also a lot of leftover oxygen. So therefore, one of the products of the chemical reaction that we can make is actually water. Making molecules of water with the remaining hydrogen and oxygen will use up all of the remaining atoms, because if you remember, atoms cannot be created or destroyed during a chemical reaction. Let's put this all together now. Here is an example of our cell. Notice how it has a semi-permeable membrane, which will allow glucose and oxygen to diffuse into the cell. The glucose comes from the small intestine, but before it got there, remember, starches or carbohydrates begin their chemical and physical digestion in the mouth, where teeth and tongue break it down, and then the amylase in your saliva mixes with the starch and breaks it down into glucose. From that point, it goes down your esophagus into your stomach, where it continues to digest, and then into your small intestines. From your small intestines, it gets diffused into the villi, and from the villi, it diffuses into your bloodstream and gets carried to your cells. The oxygen gets inhaled through your nasal passages, down your trachea, splits between your two bronchial tubes, and then branches off into the alveoli. From the alveoli, this high concentration of oxygen diffuses to an area of lower concentration in your bloodstream and gets pumped by the heart away into the other parts of your body and passes through smaller and smaller passages until it diffuses into your cell. Next, you get your product of the chemical reaction in your cells. You end up with carbon dioxide and water. However, these are not energy. These are actually waste products. The carbon dioxide has to be exhaled through your lungs, and the water, geez, how does your body get rid of water? Oh, it passes through your kidney, and then it becomes urine. So this is pretty much why you pee. However, with these waste products out of the cells, what do we actually get out of it? Where do we get the energy? Well, this whole process actually generates energy in itself. Let's think back to the brain building broadcast. In the brain building broadcast, Mr. Bingman burns a piece of cashew. The cashew is actually representative of glucose or sugar that's in your cells. When you burn something, we learn in the chemistry unit, this is a chemical reaction because your fuel, or in this case your glucose / cashew, is reacting with the oxygen in the air. The oxygen in your cells is inhaled from your lungs. Then the product of something when you burn it is carbon dioxide and water. We learned this in our chemistry unit when we burned alcohol and the products were carbon dioxide and water. But then remember in the brain building broadcast, it was heating up water. The temperature kept on rising over time as the cashew burned. And if you think back to our physics unit, thermal energy is the energy. You ever hear of burning calories? So this is happening in all of the cells of your body. Glucose is reacting with oxygen and making waste products such as carbon dioxide and water. But also, out of that chemical reaction, you're getting energy, or thermal energy. And this is what this experiment was supposed to demonstrate with burning the cashew. So let's sum up the full picture. Remember that glucose is coming from your small intestines and it's having a chemical reaction with the oxygen inhaled from your lungs. Then it creates waste products that are exhaled from your lungs and water that is passed through the kidneys. But out of that chemical reaction, you get energy in itself. So scientific principle number 10. In cells, glucose and oxygen react to form carbon dioxide and water. This reaction releases energy. And as for the waste products, scientific principle 11, carbon dioxide is carried to the lungs to be exhaled. And scientific principle number 12 tells us this excess water is removed from the blood by kidneys and passed to the bladder. So this is the whole story about how food becomes energy for your body.